One of the best ways to catch a bass, especially during the heat of the summer, is by nighttime bass fishing. There's just something fun and mysterious about it, but you can also catch some of the biggest bass of the entire summer during the night. And today I want to talk about that, as well as 5 lures that I use fishing after dark. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. Right now at Sportsman's Outfitters, you can get the exact rod and reel combos that I use for a big discount. This is my favorite rod ever. It's the Arc Tharp Series Moneymaker rod. I use this rod for so many different techniques. And right now you can get this rod as well as the Bruin ELS reel for a discount. So if you guys are interested in picking up a new combo, click that link down below in the description and save some money today. Before I talk about my favorite nighttime lures, I really just want to talk about a few general tips that I think will help you to catch a lot more bass when you are fishing at night. I actually really kind of grew up nighttime bass fishing. I had a pond in my backyard, and every summer I would always go out there and not only fish in that pond, but I would sneak off with my cousin and my best friend, and we would go fish golf course ponds. Although I'm not recommending that, we fished a ton of different ponds growing up. And once I got a boat, I started doing a lot of nighttime bass fishing from a boat in lakes, and even fished several different tournaments at night. So one thing that I have found that is really important is that you should try to minimize your use of treble hooks at night. We all know that treble hooks can be a little bit dangerous while fishing, and that's during the daytime. Now, if you add in the fact that you really can't see a whole lot during the night, if you're using baits like topwater baits that have treble hooks or crankbaits that have treble hooks, I'm just saying that you might be asking to get a hook in your hand. I'm not saying that those baits are gonna work, but you just really wanna be careful about using treble hook lures at night. The other thing that I have seen while fishing at night is that you can typically catch bass on a moving bait. So I really highly suggest to almost always fish some sort of moving bait, and then once you start maybe catching fish, then you can slow down and use some slower presentations. But a lot of times I fish almost solely moving baits at night because the bass are a little bit more active at night, especially during the summer, and you can catch them on those moving baits. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the lures that I like to use at night. And I'm actually gonna start off with a bang. This first lure is the one that I have probably caught the most nighttime bass on, and that is a Zoom horny toad, and specifically a black Zoom horny toad. Now, when it comes to color at night, you're going to see a pattern with most of the lures that I'm going to show you, and that pattern is that most of these baits are all dark. They're all black in color, maybe like a June bug, something that is really, really dark. I always grew up hearing that you want to use dark colors because they silhouette better in the water, so fish can kind of find them a little better, but I honestly think that color really doesn't make a huge difference. And the reason that I say that is that I usually start off with a dark color of some sort, but if I go through all these baits, like there have been several times where I have run out of Zoom horny toads, and I'll just pick up a white one or whatever I have, a green pumpkin, and I still catch a lot of fish. I really think that sound, vibration, and water displacement, those things are the most important when it comes to nighttime fishing, not necessarily the color. So although I'm holding up a black Zoom horny toad, and that is the one that I typically fish, I don't always think that color is a huge, huge deal. Now, with this bait, the reason that I like a Zoom horny toad so much is because you can cover a lot of water and it comes through absolutely everything. I fish the Zoom horny toad on straight 50-pound braided line and a 5/0 owner twist lock hook, and that combination can literally go through anything. So if I'm fishing it around grass or lily pads, it's gonna come through it. If I'm fishing it down a bank like this, the good thing about it is at night you can't always see that bank that great. So if you kind of overcast your bait and you get it up into those trees, the good thing is you can usually just pull it right out. If you're using a treble hooked lure in that situation, you're gonna be in the trees all night long. That is another big reason that I like to use a single hooked bait at night as opposed to those treble hooks. The other great thing about a horny toad is it is extremely easy to fish. You are literally just going to cast this bait out and you're going to reel it across the water. Now, every now and then I am going to kind of pop my reel handle and just kind of help that bait to spit and move forward really quick, because sometimes that can cause a reaction strike. But for the most part, you can cast this bait out and just reel it in. And really all you're doing is listening for a blow up. And a lot of times you will feel it hit that bait. And that is probably the most important thing with the horny toad, is when that bass hits that bait, don't just set the hook right away. Make sure you feel the weight of that fish actually pulling you down before you set the hook. Now, the next lure is actually two different lures that I'm gonna kind of lump into the same category, and that is a chatterbait or a spinnerbait. And these two lures, why I'm lumping them into kind of the same category, or the same kind of lure in general in this case, is because I use them in pretty much the exact same situations. The only difference is if I am fishing a lake or a pond that is more grassy, I'm gonna go with the chatterbait. If I'm fishing a lake or a pond that has a lot more rock and wood, I'm gonna go with the spinnerbait. But either way, these lures are pretty much kind of the same to me when it comes to nighttime fishing, because what they do is they both put off a ton of vibration. Now, could you use a spinnerbait around grass, and can you use a chatterbait around wood and rock? Absolutely, you can definitely do that. But a spinnerbait is definitely gonna come through that rock and wood a little bit better, and a chatterbait is definitely going to come through that grass a little bit better. Now, something that I do stress a lot when fishing a spinnerbait at night is I think a lot of times you will catch some of the biggest bass on either a Colorado or Indiana blade. You can use the willow blades and catch bass at night with a spinnerbait, but I have found that those bigger blades that just put off that really big thump tend to get a really big bite. Now, when I'm fishing the chatterbait at night, I'm gonna fish it very similar to the way that I fish it during the day, where if I'm fishing it around grass, I'm gonna kind of let that bait get hung up in grass and kind of snap it out of the grass. Now, sometimes you will fish ponds that don't have really grass in them, but they just kind of have some scum or some slime in them. And in those situations, I'm really just gonna have kind of a steady retrieve that I pause and pop every now and then. So I'm just gonna bring that bait. I don't like to get it in that snot or in that nasty grass, but I'm gonna bring it just above it and just kind of pop that bait every now and then, or just pause it, let it fall every now and then. And that is a great way to catch them on a chatterbait at night. Now, the retrieve that I use with a spinnerbait, there's really two main retrieves. I'm either going to slow roll that bait, slow roll it down there on the rock, bring it over lay downs, over brush piles, or I'm gonna work this bait really, really fast. I'm gonna cast this bait out and I'm gonna reel it pretty fast, and it's gonna stay just below the surface of the water. Those are the retrieves that I like with these two baits. Moving on to the third lure, this has really become probably one of my absolute favorites to use in recent times, and that is a wobble head or a swing head. When I nighttime bass fish, it is typically during the summer, and a lot of times the bass at night are still gonna be on offshore structure. Now, back in the day when I really started getting into night fishing, I used a ton of crankbaits. I used a lot of deep diving crankbaits, and I caught a lot of fish on deep diving crankbaits. But I remember so many situations where I nearly hooked myself or hooked myself with a crankbait at night. And that is one of the main reasons that I actually switched over to a wobble head, because you can really fish a wobble head or a swing head very similar to the way that you fish a crankbait, right? You cast the crankbait out and you really just reel it across the bottom, and it just kind of digs across the bottom. And I like to fish it on ledges, on humps, on points, and that's pretty much the exact same thing that I do with the swing head. I'm going to cast it out and I'm going to reel it across the bottom. But the big difference is that you're using a single hook, which is just a little bit more safe when fishing at night. You want to use a soft plastic that has a decent amount of vibration. That's really going to help the bass to hone in on it at night. You know, this is a Strike King structure bug. It was actually, I think, developed to use on a swing head, and it is one of my favorite baits to use on the swing head. Now, the absolute biggest tip that I can give you to fishing a swing head, and this is actually during the night or day, is you have to really make sure that a fish loads up on this bait before you set the hook. It is so easy as you're reeling this bait across the bottom, and that fish absolutely knocks the fire out of the bait to just swing right away. But because this bait is on the bottom, a lot of times when a bass hits it, they'll actually kind of pin it to the bottom for a second, but they really don't get that bait that great. So if you just kind of continue to slowly reel, you will feel the weight of that bass. And when you feel the weight, set the hook. Now, as far as moving lures goes, those are the ones that I pick up 95% of the time at night. And you can fish from the top all the way to the bottom with those moving baits. Now, sometimes you will get into those situations where you do start catching a lot of fish, or you found a little bit of a school. And in those situations, I do like to slow down, especially after catching a lot of fish on the moving baits. And there are two lures that are just classic nighttime great lures to use, and those are the last two that I'm going to show you. Now, the first lure that I slow down with, in the number 4 nighttime lure, is a jig. This bait right here is going to get you some giant bites at night. You know, a jig is just known for getting big bites in general, but I feel like that is even heightened at night. And the thing that I like about a jig over a lot of other soft plastics is that a jig displaces a lot of water. At night, the bass really aren't using a lot of their vision. They have to use their lateral line. So if you're using a slow moving bait, I want a bait that moves a lot of water, that displaces a lot of water. And a jig does just that. So I don't necessarily have to land this right on top of a fish. He might be able to feel that bait and hear that bait from a distance, from a couple feet away. Now, you guys know that I love the Strike King structure jig, and this is the one that I fish a lot. The biggest reason that I like this particular jig is it really comes through cover very, very well. It's called a structure jig, and it was designed to fish offshore, but this thing comes through wood really well. It can come through grass really well, not like really thick grass, but you know, sparse grass really well. It comes over rock. It just is a great weedless lure. I don't lose a lot of them, and that is why I pick up that Strike King structure jig. Now, again, the big thing with the jig is it gets big bites, but it doesn't necessarily get a lot of bites, and that actually brings me to lure number 5. This is a bait that will just get you a lot of bites at night, and that is the Zoom Old Monster Worm. At night, I specifically like a dark color like we talked about earlier. This is a June bug. You could use a straight black, but again, the big thing here is that a Zoom Old Monster is a bigger soft plastic. It displaces a lot of water. It helps those bass to hone in on that bait. Now, if you thought the Strike King structure jig was weedless, this is by far the most weedless bait that you can fish at night. So even if you're fishing it around thicker grass, this is a great bait. If you're fishing around thick wood, this is a great bait. The biggest thing that you want to make sure that you get right when fishing the big worm is your weight size. If I'm fishing pretty shallow, I like a lighter weight, something like a 1/4 ounce, even lighter at times. That 1/4 ounce will really just come through anything, especially grass that's in ponds or that snot that is in ponds. But if you're fishing it out deeper, I like to step it up a lot of times to a 3/8 ounce. Occasionally, I will use a 1/2 ounce if I'm fishing really deep, but most of the time it's a 3/8. Now, the only bad thing about a big worm is that if you nighttime bass fish for smallmouth and spotted bass, sometimes they can have a little bit of an issue getting this bait in their mouth. I have caught some smallmouth and spots on a big worm, but I have also had a lot of situations where they pick up that bait and I go to swing and set the hook on that fish, and I will literally just come back with a little bit of a nub where they just kind of took off the whole back end of my bait. So anytime I'm fishing specifically for smallmouth or spots, I'm going to replace the big worm with actually a tube jig. A tube jig is really a great bait to use at night. You can't really use it around brush, but you can use it around grass, and you can use it around rock. And a great thing about a tube jig is you can actually put a rattle inside that tube. A lot of tube jig heads actually come with a rattle on them, and that just, again, helps the bass to hone in on that bait. Now, there are a lot of guys and girls that just don't like to fish at night. So if you're fishing in really tough conditions during the middle of summer, this video right here shows you one lure that is pretty much the only lure that you need to use, as well as I catch some bass in this video. So if you enjoyed this video, you're gonna like this one. Please comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.